Hello and welcome everyone to another very exciting action-packed Magic Sandwich show brought to you for the first time on both Blog TV and Ustream. We're trying out Ustream, see how that works. We've had some feedback already, but on both the Blog TV site and also on the Ustream site we have set up a poll and would invite you please to take a moment at some stage during the course of the show. I didn't actually write the question, but I think it's pretty straightforward. Which do you prefer, Blog TV or Ustream? And let us know. And if there's a lot of people that prefer Ustream, then we'll probably start doing both for a while and see how we get on. I'm very pleased to welcome the panel today. We've got Aaron Ra, Concordance and Almighty, three of the regular people, but we're also an attempt to bring some degree of sophistication to the show. We've invited along Michael Payton. The topic, as you may have discovered from the promotional video that I put up, and Concordance also featured on his channel, basically deals with the question of how, if, as it says in the Bible, God created man in his image or their image, we'll come to that in a second, how is it that the diversity of physical traits amongst mankind is as it is? Why is it we have Aborigines in Australia and Inuits in the North Circle or whatever? I mean, it doesn't seem to make much sense. But before I come on to that point, I want to deal with a video response that was made to that video by a YouTuber called Theist77, because I think this shows classically the levels of, I think there's no other word for it, dishonesty that theists can go to. He referred to Genesis 1:26, which is a bit that I referred to. I just want to read it to you. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." Now, I'm not too bothered about who he's talking to when he says us and our. The point I want to make is that seems to me a fairly unambiguous statement using straightforward words, the meaning of which can't really be doubted. What Theist77 said in his video was that it was childish and stupid to imagine that those words can be given their ordinary meaning and interpreted in that way. He likened it to his 6-year-old daughter being told to go and clean a room or something like that. Basically, he didn't actually explain why it couldn't be interpreted in this way, save for the fact it was just childish. Well, that got me thinking, because, in effect, his interpretation, let me just read it again. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." And although he didn't expressly say this, his interpretation of that passage is, "Then God said, let us not make man in our image." It's literally the total opposite meaning. He's inserted the word not. So it made me think, you know, if it's possible to interpret the Bible in this loose way, what other effects and knock-on effects could that have? Look at the Ten Commandments. Apparently we are free. Why is it that we should interpret the Ten Commandments as they say? Why can we not add or take away the word not? Which means, of course, that then it would be perfectly acceptable to kill. The meek might be a little bit disappointed because they will not be inheriting the earth. Stick collectors on the Sabbath will probably feel a degree of relief because they will not be stoned to death. Homosexuals, it's a good day for you because you're not going to burn in hell forever for lying with another man. In fact, I'm just going to start there and see what the panel's views on this. And if Theist77 is watching the show, please send a contact request through Skype and come and explain to us how you can interpret the Bible in this rather vague way, which has no bearing on the words that are being used. Also, if anyone else wants to join the show, please do so. There are a couple of other topics I'm going to raise before we start taking callers, but let's start with that. Who wants to comment on this? Concordance.
Don't not cook a baby calf in its mother's milk, which means I can, in fact, do that now?
Well, who can say?
Well, if you can interpret it any way that you want to, I mean, then certainly you could add extra negatives as necessary. So that whenever you need it to be positive, you just add another not to it.
Michael, what's your take on this? Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you. It's just laughable. It's ridiculous. There are different ways that people apparently have interpreted that particular passage, but this definitely isn't one of them. It's just ludicrous. I don't think there's anything more to say than that.
I'm the way, the truth, and the light. There is no other way to the Father except through me, not like the Borat way. We just have the Borat Bible where we just put not after everything that we don't like.
Well, could we add other words besides not? Like maybe we could say there are a few other ways to the Father besides me? Or maybe, that there's almost no other way?
But I mean, the reason I say it's dishonest is it's because abundantly clear that he cannot answer this question of, explaining the diversity of physical traits amongst humans throughout the world and why they're geographically located pretty much clearly. He can't explain that, so it's easy for him to say, oh, well, you can't interpret that way. But I just want to know what else you can't interpret. I mean, something as simple and straightforward as that, I just don't get it. But
okay,
it wasn't really, I'm actually going to throw out a few other things as well, though, because that wasn't really what I wanted to talk about during the course of the show. What was more interest to me is, I suppose, the psychological aspect of it, because I suspect that all of us here and everyone watching the show was at some time religious. And I'm also fairly confident that whilst being religious, they had an image of their God. They could picture their God when they prayed to him or whatever. I suspect also that most people's view of God, or the way in which they picture him, probably was as is and has been represented in Western art for several hundred years. Namely, an old man, obviously he has to be old because he's wise, and you don't get wise without being old. He's got a beard. But more importantly, he's white. Now, two things come as a matter of that. Firstly, the one thing that we can say with a great deal of confidence is Jesus would not have been white. Secondly, if you accept, as the overwhelming evidence suggests, that we all effectively came out of Africa, we're all descendants from black people, and if God made man in his likeness, then God must almost certainly be black. But I wonder, and I haven't got an answer to this, I wonder whether black people picture, or some black people picture their God, the Christian God, to be white. I know that there are some churches in America that do have depictions of Jesus as a black person, but I just wonder how widespread that is. And what does it tell us, if anything, about the psychology of religion and whether it is indeed a man-made construct as opposed to the other way around? Michael, I think you've got a few views on this.
Yes, I think most of religious beliefs, with very few exceptions, to the point where we'd question whether they actually qualify as religious beliefs at all of them, to a certain extent, mirror the society that they come from. So Islamic depictions of paradise, for instance, look a lot like an oasis. Actually, I have a painting of an Islamic oasis. And it's a constant reminder to me that their version of paradise was strongly influenced by the social and historical context which gave rise to them. Similarly, when we look at European modes of Christianity, they quickly turned Jesus from being, actually very fascinating, would be the Nazi interpretations of Christianity. If you look at the history of what was called positive Christianity, which was a version of Christianity endorsed by National Socialism in Germany, they explicitly gave Jesus the characteristics of being anti-Semitic, being Aryan, being a fascist. Like, it's incredibly telling when you have such divergent opinions of not just Jesus, but of God, of all religious beliefs, being not just influenced, but I think fundamentally dictated by the belief system which gave rise to them.
Before God's hair went white, he must have been blonde.
I'll tell you, before God's hair went white, he was Zeus. That's what I think. I think that the classical influence of Zeus as the father of the gods was immediately transferred into this medieval and Renaissance conception of God, which is why you can see him wearing, a robe, a flowing robe, or, something that would have been very appropriate to Zeus, standing on a throne, or we can't see that, Aaron. There you go. There is so much borrowing that goes on when cultural mixing occurs, and even in the successive cultures of classical versus post-classical Europe, I think Zeus is where we get these conceptions from.
Well, here's the proof of it. I mean, this is a painting of the baby Jesus, and can you get any more Anglo than that? I mean, look at this boy. Look at those pretty little curly blonde hair. Huh? There you go. Documentary proof.
So was he born with a full head of hair and a full set of teeth?
What was that man doing with the axe?
I think he was the huntsman that comes to kill the wolf. I don't know. I could be getting my fairy tale.
I think that we would probably see that in other religions as well. If you trace not the etymology, but the origins of these different conceptions of God, you would find them to be very provincial. And Jehovah is a very provincial Jewish kind of God. He's, Middle East, real estate obsessed, vindictive type of Eastern despot. And you translate that into different value systems, and it didn't catch on, right? And this is one of the things that really strikes me. This is what DP and I were talking about this topic. What really got me thinking was, why did Jehovah just pick this one tiny little group of people, and we feel well in the middle of nowhere, when, in China at about the same time, they were already starting to develop the origins of science and technology. They already had very advanced agricultural and social systems, and yet they didn't get picked. They were much more prepared for the kind of revelations that we're talking about. And they had good writing, and they had a very detailed historical science. So it's really interesting that all these gods are such provincial little gods, and so out of proportion to the size of the planet.
Well,
and then even after that, it's out of proportion to the size of the universe. It's not the right size of God, and we just keep kind of expanding our conception as we move along, so that I don't think that a Bronze Age person would recognize what we're talking about today with theology.
Yeah, Wildwood Claire did a video very recently where she showed Andrew Snelling, who famously worked as a professional geologist in mainstream science and also as a creationist writer, wherein Monday through Friday he was himself identifying and dating, the age of rock formations in the billions of years using, approved and testable methods. And then he would write articles for creation magazines where he was arguing that the world is only 6,000 years old and that you choose what evidence you're going to believe. And in fact, you can choose to believe things when there's no evidence for it at all. She cited another guy in the same video who stated that his education would imply that it's absolutely certain that the world is 4.7 billion years old, but that's not a date he wants to agree with. He doesn't want to agree with it, so to hell with it. He's going to believe what he wants to believe because he wants to believe it, even if he knows it isn't true. And that's where you come with these people. They're all talking about pretend. It is not. It's not the same thing as believing I have a parrot behind me. I can demonstrate that. Okay, for these people, it's believing that they have a red and orange dragon behind them. It's making it up.
Similarity between Yahweh and Zeus. They may actually, Yahweh may have actually gotten his name from Zeus, because you have east to west. You have a similar pantheon of gods from all the way from India to the Mediterranean, and you'll see similarities between their pantheons and how they're set up and the different roles given to the gods. And the thunder god, who is at the head of the pantheon, which I think is represented by Indra in India and by Zeus in Greece, he became known as Jupiter, and he's basically the same person in the Roman pantheon. But his Jupiter means the pater after stands for father, and his core root name was Yue, and there's no consonantal root in the Semitic vocabulary that we've ever found that corresponds to this, whereas all of the other pagan deities worshipped by, for example, the early Arabs and so forth, all of their names can be traced to earlier gods, or just like the Greco-Roman pantheons are similar. You can do a side-by-side comparison of the different Afro-Asiatic gods, and you always find these sort of doppelgangers. But Yahweh kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, and the earliest known documents of his worship date to around the time that Rome was just becoming a big cultural exporter. They hadn't conquered the Near East at the time, but it's very likely, we'll never really know, I don't know if we'll ever know for sure, but it's quite likely that Yahweh is in fact a foreign god and is actually just Yue from Rome.
We learn a lot about human psychology by studying these comparative religions, and one thing I can say for sure is that ancient people were terrified of lightning. Right? That always seems to be at the very pinnacle of whatever forces they attribute to the supernatural.
And did anybody mention the thing about, make us in our own images, of course, adapted from earlier polytheism?
Tell us about that, Aaron.
I don't remember if it's in Enuma Elish or the Epic of Atrahasis, but one of them names the goddess who says that, let us create man, and it's a team of gods, and they create 7 figurines for men and 7 figurines for women. They're all little clay figures. And then they have to kill a god in order to drain his blood, to wash them in the blood. So they're all anointed in the blood of this, sacrificed god. And then she breathes into them the breath of life, and these golems come to life. And so you have a team of gods creating, in 6 generations, you have 6 divine generations, and the 6th generation created man so that the 7th generation of gods could rest. That's why there's so much ambiguity in what the words mean. Does it mean, does it mean 6 days, or is it 6 progressions, or, whatever increments there are at 6 generations is what the original adaptation was. And that Atrahasis and Enuma Elish are both written by the grandparents of the biblical authors. They're the same people. They come from the same origin, but they come from about 1,000 years earlier, according to the finds in Ashurbanipal's library.
I have to say that if I was going to... Sorry, Michael, I'll come to you in a second. If I was going to follow any religion, I think the mythology of the Greeks is the one that I find most appealing, and it also makes most sense.
That's mine.
You can't see that. Oh, yes. But, I mean, the Greeks had it right, or the Greek gods had it right. I mean, they imbued their gods with human characteristics. So explaining things such as, why do bad things happen, why is there evil in the world, was very easy. One of the gods woke up with a hangover, was in a bad mood, and started throwing things around a bit. As I say, it all seems to make much more sense than having an all-loving, omnipresent single entity. Michael, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to echo some of Aaron's points, because he's spot on right. It's actually in the passage that we just mentioned, the use of the plural pronoun to identify with God is actually also found in other places, in the book of Isaiah and the book of Job as well, where God is identified not as being a single person, but being a sort of pantheon of angelic figures. And this is interpreted as being directly plagiarized from Sumerian religious beliefs. So I think it is the Enuma Elish, and the similarities don't stop there. The wind god that they believe eventually became Yahweh, which was Marduk, was believed to have rebelled against chaos and then used his wind sword or wind weapon in order to create flooding that destroyed the entire world. And so we see, like, not just the sort of characteristics of God, but also the ability to use flooding as a weapon, different personality characteristics, and even like the linguistic chain or linguistic history of the words match up very quickly.
Michael, you were supposed to come on to bring us a degree of sophistication, not to talk about flatulence. Aaron.
Well, I was just going to add to what Michael was saying when he was talking about the air god, and he mentioned Marduk. I wanted to mention that the Theban air god was Amun, which, of course, became a composite god in what is arguably, or at least according to archaeology, the earliest monotheistic religion, when, of course, you have Amun-Ra. We had a combination of the air god and the sun god, and when it was an air god, when it was just Amun, as an air god, he had a wife at that time, and so his history there was following a sort of a similar parallel to what they're now talking about with Yahweh, once upon a time having a wife, and then the tradition eliminates her. So much the same as it did with Amun. When he was an air god, he had the ability to be felt in the breeze, but not actually be visible, and this, of course, enabled him to be anywhere at once, which, of course, made him everywhere at once.
So this is what fascinates me about the anthropology of religion is, you know, it's so reflective of the culture it's built in. If you really wanted to persuade me and there were a real supernatural deity that wanted to impress me, I think appearing simultaneously to all these people at exactly the same time would be very persuasive. But in fact, you know, we don't see Native American paintings on walls that reflect, you know, similar beliefs. And it's very hard to readjust the mythologies that go into, like, the story of Jehovah. Where do the Native Americans fit into that? How does that make them feel to know that, you know, they weren't even on the same continent when God revealed his one true message, and they don't get to hear about it for another couple hundred years, right? Well, it's so out of proportion to what I would think would be fair, right, or some sense of justice.
Mm-hmm. An interesting point there too is I think every person that's interested in these topics should also look at what's happening now with missionary work, or what's happened in the last few centuries with missionary work. There's extensive texts on exactly how they go about changing people's religious beliefs in tribal or pre-technological societies. And a great example of this would be in the Fang people of Gabon, had basically a theistic belief. They believed that there was one God that created the natural world and one God that created the technological world. But these gods were completely unimportant to the day-to-day operation of society. So they'd actually do their rituals towards ancestors. They believed in evil acts were committed by witches. But they had a sort of semi-theological aspect to their belief system. And what missionaries did when they began infiltrating into these communities, which have been, and this has been documented through the work of anthropologists, is that instead of just fully replacing these tribal beliefs with Christian beliefs, what they did was they said that the God that they formerly thought made the entire natural world, they just added attributes to him. They said, well, actually, yeah, that was still right. That God is still existent. But he's also a God that you can now pray to. And he did come to to the earth, and he did perform miracles. Those are the kinds of things that missionaries do, and that's the actual work that takes place. And what's unfortunate is that, which I've done videos on actually, is that they've maintained both this incredibly poisonous attribute from European Christianity of fighting against evil, and maintained their belief in witches, which has resulted in a horrible treatment of often children, where they're accused of witchcraft and then mutilated, killed, stoned to death in incredibly awful and really often bizarre ways. And these are influenced primarily, and I think also carried forward to a large extent by Christian missionaries and Christian influence in these areas.
Yeah, I'd like to throw something else in about that since you mentioned missionaries. I once had an encounter when I was about 14 years old with a handful of Mormon missionaries, and they told me that the mark of the devil was cast upon Cain, and the mark of the devil was to make him black. And I asked, how could you come to that conclusion? And they said, well, they said that the mark of the devil was something that you would be able to recognize a mile away, and you can recognize black people a mile away. And I remember bringing up right at that point that one of this girl I was dating in high school was half black. I didn't know that until I met her dad. And I was also dating this Japanese girl, and I thought, now her you could recognize from a mile away. So are you sure that the almond-shaped eyes are not actually the mark of the devil? And of course, they just absolutely rejected that. I thought I would bring that up since we're bringing up, what image is God in, since He made us in His image. Does He have those folds under His eyes? I mean, because otherwise, if you're looking at the black thing, we have white people with curly hair, we have black people with freckles. I mean, where's the distinctive trait that doesn't exist in one race that is existing in the other? And so I argue with these missionaries a bit.
Well, their logic is completely flawed that you can see them a mile away. It depends on the lighting conditions. If it's really dark, you'd only see their eyes and teeth.